So the next session, storytelling from jobs to journeys. Why don't kids dream of becoming call center agents? I think that's a great title. Rethinking motivation, meaning, and measurable impact in customer-facing roles. So Danny Wong, Director of Business Operations and Customer Experience at Ecobee.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I think everyone saw the question. So today I'm going to be here sharing something we don't really talk about or really ask ourselves. And that's, why don't kids grow up dreaming about becoming call center agents? Think about that. It's not a question about talent. Right? It's definitely not a question about capability. It's a question whether the work feels meaningful, whether people can see how their work connects to something bigger. Over time, many frontline roles started to be seen as temporary, transactional, stepping stone, sometimes replaceable. But if you look closer, these roles sit in the heart of the customer experience. They shape how customers feel. They influence loyalty, and they drive revenue. So maybe the real question isn't why people don't dream of these jobs. Maybe the question is, how do we design them so people would want to? How do we turn frontline roles into journeys of growth, journeys of pride, and impact? Because when work feels meaningful, motivation changes. And when motivation changes, performance follows. So that shift from jobs to journeys is what we're here to talk about today. When we say journeys, we don't mean titles or promotion. What we mean is growth. We mean helping people build skills that they can see over time and feel over time. We mean creating experiences that can help them build confidence in real work. A journey isn't a single course, or a one-time training. It's development that builds over time. It's intentional development that can be tied to real work. So when growth is designed this way, it doesn't feel random. It feels purposeful. It feels intentional, and it feels connected. And when people can see that they understand how their growth leads to impact, and that's where everything starts to work together. A lot of times we treat customer experience, employee experience, and business results as three different conversations. But they're not. They're part of one connected system. You see, when employees build the right skills and confidence, conversations with customers improve. And better conversations lead to stronger customer outcomes, right? Stronger satisfaction, better NPS, better retention, higher revenue. And when people see those results, they feel proud of the work they're doing. And pride strengthens retention. And when people stay longer, they have more time to develop those skills and build the confidence. Right? And that's when the flywheel starts spinning on its own. But for a flywheel to spin on its own, it needs the right inputs. Right? And what keeps it moving? Well, it's feedback. The voice of the customer turns customer feedback into action. I think we all know that. It's not just about measuring performance, though. You can use that to help our agents see what's working and where they can improve. And when agents sees feedback in real time, They can build the skills that they can use in the very next interaction. They listen more closely, they can anticipate needs, they can solve problems better, they can build better relationships with our customers. And over time, those skills show up in patterns. In practice, this feedback helps agents do a few really important things. They recognize reoccurring friction early. They can anticipate when customers may be at risk of leaving. They can anticipate what a customer might need next. And they can uncover opportunities to deepen relationships and even create sales naturally. So when we connect agent behaviors, customer feedback, and business results, we can clearly see what drives performance. Agents can see the impact of their actions, and that visibility strengthens their skills, it helps them build confidence, and it helps them keep improving over time. And as AI and automation continues to evolve, investing in human skills becomes even more important. More routines and transactions are being automated. And what's left are the moments where human judgment, empathy, really shapes the experience. You can automate workflows, and I think we've heard a lot of examples today, and a lot of us are probably doing that right now. Right? And AI can support decisions and answer questions. And again, we've seen examples and we've heard examples of that today. But conversations that requires judgment, empathy, confidence are where people matter the most. And that's why investing in human skills is critical in this AI-driven world. And here's how we put it into action. So at Ecobee, I'm from Ecobee. I think if I introduce myself from the slide, at Ecobee we introduce something really important. We've invested heavily in technical training. People were learning, yet they still felt stuck. So we shifted. We shifted from designing courses to designing systems. And we designed the systems called Pathways. So Pathways is a program we designed to support employee development. You can think of Pathways as a guided development for people's roles, where learning connects to real work and what comes next. Employees are in control of their own growth. They can clearly see how their development shows up in their day-to-day work. Progress isn't just about completing steps or checking off a couple of checkboxes. Progress shows up in growth they can see and feel. And most importantly, through Pathways, people build real, transferable skills. Skills like communication, critical thinking, problem solving, decision quality, conflict management, confidence. These skills matter way beyond just the workplace. These skills show up in everyday life. And when people see themselves growing in meaningful ways, their engagement shifts. And within Pathways, we also created the Career Experience program. And it's a hands-on experience across different parts of the company. This is where our agents can build new skills. They get to see how other teams work together, and they learn alongside a mentor. But let me be clear about something. These programs aren't built around promotions. Participating in Pathways, the Career Experience programs, it doesn't guarantee a promotion. We don't tell our teams that. Some people stay in the same role for years, and they're still highly engaged. Growth isn't vertical. It's not about climbing from title to title to title. Right? Growth, it's about growing wider. It's about gaining depth. It's about building new skills. It's about experiences that matter. I always say, you don't grow this way, you grow this way. And we also make sure people understand where the company is heading and how their work fits in that direction. They're not just on the bus. Our teams know where that bus is heading, and they know why their seat matters on that bus. When their day-to-day work aligns with growth, it aligns with impact, it aligns with direction, their engagement fuels the system. That momentum starts building. Performance grows, and that cycle continues over and over and over again. So when we redesign work around growth, here's what happened. So in 2021, our turnover, that's 64%. And that was the year where we began shifting from jobs to journeys, starting with the Career Experience Program and then expanding it from there year after year. And in 2022, it dropped to 38%. 2023 fell again, 34%. And by 2024, you guessed it, dropped again to 11%. And this remains strong since. And this, everyone, this wasn't luck. It wasn't luck. It was a lot of hard work, but it was a steady shift. And during the same period, our overall engagement increased by 16%. People believed that they had real career opportunities. That increased by 13%. And more people felt we truly invested in continuous learning. That went up 8%. But the most important change, it wasn't these numbers. People stop asking, what's next for me? And they start preparing for it. That shift changed how people showed up. It changed how people served customers. And it also changed who chose to stay. We didn't reduce turnover with perks or rewards. We reduced it by redesigning meaning. So the real question, how do you do this on your own team? And you don't need our programs. You just need to think differently about growth. And here are 3 things you can start as soon as Thursday after this conference. First, map the journey, not just the role. Ask yourself, from this seat in this room, what could someone on your team become in the next 12 to 24 months? What could someone on your team become in the next 12 to 24 months? If that path isn't clear, it's hard for people to feel motivated today. But if the future is visible, today's work feels meaningful. And that clarity helps shape how people show up. Second, turn feedback into fuel. Many teams treat voice of the customer as reporting. Instead, use that as coaching. Show people how their actions lead to results. Bring feedback into real conversations. Highlight the strengths and not just the gaps. Data shouldn't exist just to monitor performance, but it should be there to help people grow. And when feedback becomes developmental, that changes the culture. And third, make progress visible. Growth has to be seen to be felt. So create clear signals that development is happening. Things like skill milestones and cross-functional experiences, new responsibilities, recognition. When people see progress, they believe in it. And when they believe in it, engagement grows. And when daily work feels connected to growth and impact, people invest more. And that's when performance follows. Because when growth is intentional, it doesn't just improve results. It changes how people see their work. It changes how people see their future. And it changes what people believe is possible. And that's really what it's all about. So let's go back to where we started. Why don't kids grow up dreaming of becoming call center agents? Maybe it's not the role. Maybe it's just how we designed it. When frontline work is built as a journey, with growth, with feedback, with visible impact, performance follows, right? Engagement follows, business results follows. And as more work becomes automated, the human side becomes even more important. And the real opportunity isn't to make these roles glamorous. It's to design them so they're worth growing in. Because when we design growth intentionally, we don't just improve performance. We change what people believe is possible. And when people believe more is possible, they show up differently. They show up differently for their teams, they show up differently for customers, and they show up for the future that we're building together through all these changes. And that is the work ahead of us. Thank you.
A really good story here. Oh, several over here, it looks like.
Thanks, Danny. That was really good. And I can tell you, I'm come from TD, and we're very aligned to your vision there. One question is, Sam Altman said no more call centers in 2 years, right? So everything is going to be automated. But obviously, the reality is different. So you as a visionary, when you close your eyes and say, this is what the agents are looking at 2028, what do you define as skills and tools? And you've mentioned some of it, but I kind of want you to just focus on that answer.
Yeah. Skills and tools. So I think there are two different things. There's always the soft skills that we're building, right? I think it goes back into we're building these skills like critical thinking and problem solving and communication, right? Those are skills that are not just utilized in the workplace, but utilized in day-to-day life. So when we're able to develop those lifelong skills for our team, right, and they see the impact outside of work, and that's where that retention grows, because they feel value in what they're doing. When we talk about tools, there's a lot of tools and a lot of technologies that we're developing right now, but we need people to help support those development of those tools and those technologies. So additional skills that we're building that's more related and aligned to the workplace are the technical skills. So when we build technology for our team, it's really for our teams to use. And who's better to test those and UAT those than our frontline team members? So we help develop those skills where they can understand how the technology works. They're the first one to test it, and they're the first one to provide us with feedback. And those who are really interested in learning more about building, for example, AI, building AI and prompt engineering, we provide them with those type of training so they're able to do it as well. So they get hands-on development of those tools. So there's two different type of kind of skills. There's like the soft skills, but there's also like the hard skills that we would provide as well.
Could I ask a follow-up question? So, because turnover is more or less 2 years, let's say. So that means we're hiring today for the agent that's going to be effective in their role 2 years from now. So how do you screen them? Who do you pick?
Yeah, that's a great question. We look at people, so again, when we do all our hiring, it's based on the soft skills and what they're looking to do, right? Do they see themselves, with us for 2, 3, even 4 years, right? So when we do the initial screening, it's soft skills. We never really hire for the technical skills. Technical, that's the easy part. I mean, I say that Ecobee is pretty, if you ever had to install a thermostat and rewire HVAC, that's pretty hard. But we look for people who are passionate about technology, who loves learning, right? Who's not afraid to stop learning. If you have that passion of curiosity and learning, this is the right place for you. So those are some of the skills and values that we look for, which are applicable. It doesn't matter kind of what you do.
Thank you.
Other questions? Nope. So I'll follow up with one. So you talk about this a little bit, and I know earlier today we were talking about some of the challenges, backfill and finding customers and turnover and things of that nature. What are you doing that maybe diversifies the day of one of your agents, so maybe they don't feel too narrowly stuck in one role? Do you get them and move them across roles so it's more interesting of a day?
Definitely, yeah. That's where we developed the Career Experience Program, where it gives those some agents are happy to do what they do. They come in and they love speaking to customers on the phone, and that's it. But there's always those agents who want more and want to be able to learn new things, and that's where these programs comes in. So the Career Experience Program allows them to spend part of the day in different roles. We have some programs where they actually spend the entire 40 hours a week in different roles for a certain amount of time, but that gives them some variety, as well as there's different projects that we're able to build that are tied back to our business. So an example we talked about was doing UAT testing. So when we're launching internal AI tools or external AI tools, we need people to test those. Right? And who are the best people to test them are the people who use them every single day. And that gives them variety in their specific day, but that also gives them ownership and a stake in the business decision, right? So when they see that they're part of the decision and part of the design and implement of those tools, that's where they feel proud of their work, and that helps with the retention.
All right, help me thank Danny.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's a great way to end the morning as we go to lunch. One of the challenges we have in the contact center, and I love what Ecobee is doing with and what Danny described from that perspective, moving agents around, giving them a diversified opportunity and so forth. I know when in the call centers I ran in the past, that was not always very easy because, one, we had too much demand and not enough people already because of turnover. So some of you may be feeling like, well, I'd love to do that, but I can't even answer the calls that come in from that perspective. And this is where the organization there has to be a certain level of that change. We started today specifically about how do we think less about the contact center as cost center to value center. That's the kind of value that often doesn't show up on the balance sheet, right? The value not only of creating a better environment for each of those agents who, like me, didn't grow up to say, I want to be a call center agent, but that was the first job I got out of college after working in restaurants. But that's the opportunity we have, is to invest back into them, and it will pay for itself. And it just takes a little bit of that investment from a senior perspective at the organization and really understanding what that opportunity is and playing that to the C-suite, if you will, and letting them understand that as well. All right.